to being interested in the railroads?
I think his long-time association with warehousing and so on the Mississippi, outfitting the railroads and so on. Railroading was a second career for Jim Hill. He was pushing 40 at the time and came on as a manager really for the old St. Paul and Pacific to link the Twin Cities with Winnipeg through the Red River Valley. It's what became the Manitoba line. This is the St. Paul and Pacific, which had a land grant to build a line from the Twin Cities up the Red River Valley of the North to the Canadian border, where it would be linked up with another line to Winnipeg. As soon as that was done, by 1880, then they formed the old St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba line.
Before Hill began the Great Northern, he was involved in the Canadian Pacific. Why?
Brief interlude. One, he was asked to be. George Stevens, who was his principal backer, or one of his principal backers on this side of the border, was also involved in the Canadian Pacific Railroad. Hill also wanted a line to the West Coast. He understood that that trade would be pivotal. The Canadian Pacific was on the ground moving, and it wasn't the Northern Pacific, which already had its transcontinental line. Hill found himself in a bitter rivalry with the NP until 1896, when he, backed by J.P. Morgan, started to take it over, basically.
How did the construction of the Great Northern become one of his passions?
Hill, I think, wanted everything to work right. And he was, I suppose, what we'd call now a micromanager. He wanted to know every detail as well as the large policy considerations. So he oversaw everything, not only the Great Northern Line, but the steamship lines. He ran everything. This was his style. Coupled with being a workaholic. He frequently was up, till 2, 3, 4 in the morning.
The Northern Pacific Railway had begun its line to the West Coast from a point just west of Lake Superior in 1870. Another railroader, one of the most colorful, Henry Villard, took over the Northern Pacific as president in 1881 and completed the line to the West Coast, which had been started by smaller lines from both directions.
Shake hands with the eastern crowd in a friendly kind of way. For the east is east and the west is west, but the twain have met today.
Shake hands with Walla Walla, St. Cloud, St. Paul and Slate.
Shake hands with Deer Lodge, Red Lodge, Bozeman is on the way.
Dawson, Judson,
Dickinson, Garrison,
Forest Lake, Moose Lake,
Big Lake, Clear Lake, Tower City,
Valley City,
Rush City, Pine City, Miles City, and Cloquet. Shake hands with the eastern crowd in a friendly kind of way. For the east is east and the west is west, but the twain have met today. Shake hands with
Kennewick, Trout Creek, Gold Creek,
Mandan,
Ellensburg,
Freiburg,
Blasburg,
Ferndale, Ravensdale,
Belfield,
Garfield,
Gartown,
Connell,
Hope,
Antelope,
Carlton,
Crookston,
Castleton, Clarkston,
Royalton,
Richardson, Easton,
Elliston,
Wapaton,
Mapleton,
Lewiston,
Livingston,
Horton,
Bluffton,
Tustin,
Drayton,
Grafton,
and Spokane. Shake hands with the eastern crowd in a friendly kind of way. For the east is east and the west is west, but the twain have met today.
Like Villard, Hill brought immigrants from Europe to settle the vast lands of the Northwest. In the years prior to its inclusion in the Burlington Northern, the Great Northern Railway made numerous films for promotional purposes. In one of those, a film called Empire on Parade, the Great Northern announcer put Jim Hill's vision like this.
Since it went through unpopulated territory, who and what would this new railroad carry? But to its founder, the equation was simple. There was land without people, and there were people without good land. He would bring them together. In a single decade, Jim Hill brought 500,000 people to match the plains and mountains of the Northwest.
In many things, Hill was a great believer in that if settlers, businesses, and so on prospered along his lines, his railroad would prosper. His primary interest was freight traffic and in what was a largely undeveloped land in the Northwest from here, from the Twin Cities to Seattle. Wanted to see lots of farmers doing very well. He involved himself in a lot of things, urged at many county fairs and other forums diversification of crops, gave, leased, and loaned livestock from his own North Oaks farm to various cattlemen and farmers along the line. Really ran his North Oaks farm north of St. Paul as a private experimental farm, and they would try out various breeds, various types of crops and so on, and export that knowledge along the lines.
The Northern Pacific and the Great Northern at one time were fierce competitors.
The Northern Pacific went bankrupt in the Panic of 1893, and Hill moved within a year, again backed by J.P. Morgan and other financial interests, to obtain de facto control of the NP. They did that by 1901, moving in the Northern Securities Company.
The Northern Pacific's first locomotive was the Minnetonka. It was delivered to the NP in 1870, saw construction work in both Minnesota and Washington. Later it was sold to a logging company. In retirement, it was discovered by Northern Pacific men and refurbished for operation in both the Chicago and New York World's Fairs of the 1930s. Here it runs at the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948. The Northern Pacific's construction under Henry Villard came as a result of a visit by Villard to Germany. Their investors in American railroads asked him to represent their interests in the United States. He not only did that, but eventually formed a company of his own, which acquired ownership of the Northern Pacific. So there was European money in the railroad, and it had land grants like most of the other lines of that day. It also had debts, which came home to roost in the Panic of 1893. That was just 1 year after Hill had finished his line to the Pacific, and Hill began his efforts, which, as we have seen, resulted in his control of the NP. One of the outstanding differences between the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern was mostly a private operation, funded privately, and under Hill's leadership was relatively free of debt. That was one of its strong points. The other was that it had the shortest route and the straightest track of any of the previously built transcontinentals, including the Northern Pacific and the Union Pacific. But it took some doing. The locomotive William Crook's was the first engine to run out of St. Paul. It was said to be Jim Hill's favorite engine, and well, it may have been. Along with hundreds of others, he had watched it come ashore from a barge which had been pushed up the Mississippi to St. Paul from Prairie du Chien by the steamboat Alhambra. That was September 9th of 1861. The William Crook's, named after the first construction engineer on the Minneapolis and Pacific Railroad, had steamed from Paterson, New Jersey, the erecting shops there, to Prairie du Chien. The next year, on June 28th of 1862, the little engine hauled 2 cars 10 miles from St. Paul to the village of St. Anthony, now Minneapolis. It was the first railroad out of the Twin Cities. A newspaper man who witnessed the trip observed, "A passenger train started from St. Paul in the direction of Puget Sound today." By 1886, the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba tracks had reached Minot, Dakota Territory, ready to set the stage for one of the great epochs in railroad construction. In 1887, the line was graded and bridged for 545 miles to Great Falls, mostly through unsettled country. The logistics of an operation so distant from sources of supply were staggering. 8,000 men, 3,300 teams of horses pushed the construction. On August 11th, 44,100 feet of track were laid in a single day. By November, the tracks had been pushed to Helena, where there was a connection with the Northern Pacific, which had been completed to the Pacific Ocean 4 years before. In 1889, Jim Hill committed his railroad to go the distance, all the way to Puget Sound and the Pacific Ocean's promise of trade with the Orient. It was a most eventful year. It saw the railroad become the Great Northern. In that same year, on December 11th, in temperatures 40 degrees below zero, engineer John J. Stevens discovered Marias Pass. That was the lowest crossing of the mountains of any of the northern lines, only 5,213 feet above sea level. For a time, until the tunnels through the mountains were finished, the Great Northern used switchbacks. Actually, the only way through the rugged cascade was by tunnel, but the steam locomotives produced too much smoke and toxic fumes for tunnels, one of which was 8 miles long. So electric engines were used. One of Jim Hill's favorite engineers was a young Ralph Budd, who later became the president of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and eventually was chairman of the Chicago Transit Authority. The former executive director of the CTA, rail historian George Crambles, knew Budd well.
Ralph Budd was extremely fascinating to me because he served as the chairman of Chicago Transit Authority from 1949 to 1954, and it was my chance to get personally acquainted with this wonderful engineer and remarkable person. His work in connection with the Cascade Tunnel was a highlight of his career under Jim Hill.
So abrupt was the rise of the original route laid out by John Stevens over the Cascade Mountains, they had to have a series of switchbacks on each side of the saddle in order to surmount it with reasonable grades. And it had to have a locomotive at each end of the train in order to negotiate those switchbacks. The diagrams make very plain the method by which the engineers of the Great Northern surmounted the obstacle of the great mountain chain which was across their path. At the end of the first short length of track, called a leg, the train stops, switches are thrown, and the train starts in the other direction on the second step or leg. This process is followed until the height of the summit is reached. Then the train rounds at the top of the summit, and the process is reversed by a series of switchbacks on the opposite side. A total of 8 switchbacks were required. At the time, he appreciated the desirability for, and anticipated even, the construction of a tunnel to eliminate the switchbacks. Such a tunnel was constructed in 1900, being a little more than 2.5 miles in length, extending from Tye on the western side to a place called Cascade Tunnel on the east. This tunnel did away with all of the switchbacks, shortened the distance by 9 miles, reduced the maximum grade from 4% to 2.2%, eliminated 2,332 degrees of curvature. It also eliminated the worst, most vulnerable part of the line for snow troubles. The first step taken by the Great Northern toward electrification in the Cascades was in 1909, when the tunnel from Tye to Cascade Tunnel Station was electrified to eliminate the serious smoke and gas conditions which had developed with increasing traffic, and to improve operating conditions for heavy freight trains through the tunnel. Trains were operated over the summit for 7 years, with a great deal of difficulty due to the 8 reversals, hand braking, heavy grades, and severe winter climate. The first Cascade Tunnel and the 3-phase electrification served the GN well for many years, but there still were serious problems on the mountain. Every winter, snow, and more snow fell in the Cascades, and on March 1st, 1910, a snowslide at Wellington swept away a trapped passenger train, all 4 electric locomotives, a rotary plow, a business car, and part of the town, with a loss of 96 lives. The Wellington disaster caused Hill to spend over $1.5 million on snow sheds. So many snow sheds were built that there were 6 miles of them in one 8-mile stretch of railroad. Many, built of concrete, stand today in silent tribute to the viciousness of the elements. The long roundabout route up to the old tunnel at a continuous grade of 2.2% created a lot of operating difficulties as well. As early as 1912 and again in 1914 and 15, studies had been made to see if a better route could not be found. The World War intervened, but studies continued for a major line relocation. Finally, a decision was made, and in November 27th, Thanksgiving Day 1925, a contract was let to build a new 8-mile tunnel at a lower elevation. Toward the end of 1925, work had been commenced simultaneously on new locomotives, a substation at Skykomish, and trolley construction from Skykomish to Tye. This had been completed in time for the first train to run from Skykomish to Cascade Tunnel, hauled by an electric locomotive, on March 5th, 1927. The change from operation with the old 3-phase locomotives to operation with the new single-phase was accomplished without incident or delay. The single-phase trolley had been installed through the tunnel between the 2 trolleys that were already there, forming part of the old system, and the pantographs were equipped with temporary short horns in order to clear the other wires. All of the freight trains and the majority of the passenger trains were hauled from Skykomish to Cascade Tunnel with electric locomotives until November 1928, when the trolley construction on the east side between Bern and Wenatchee was completed. During this period, it was sometimes necessary to smoke a passenger train partway up the grade due to insufficient motive power. Now that's the grade of the old line, but it was always arranged to haul them through the old Cascade Tunnel by electric power. After the line between Bern and Wenatchee had been electrified, a steam locomotive was used to haul the electric locomotive and its train over the unelectrified gap between Bern and Cascade Tunnel, and the electric locomotives hauled all passenger trains between Skykomish and Wenatchee. The steam locomotives were then cut off the train at each end of the electrified section and were not hauled through as previously had been the case. In constructing the tunnel, the following advantages were perceived. First, they would have permanent protection from snow slides. Obviously, it's not going to snow in the tunnel. They'd eliminate the heavy expenditures for maintaining those snow sheds. They'd reduce the operating costs through the heavy snow belt during winter months. They'd shorten the distance by several miles and eliminate much of the heavy curvature and lower that summit of elevation, lessening the total rise and fall, which has to be paid for in continual operation of trains. An outlay in excess of $10 million, which at the time was a considerable expenditure, but it was fully justified by the elimination of the troublesome features of the line. The construction work for the tunnel, carried out by contractors, was all done by electric power or by compressed air supplied from electrically driven compressors. For handling the excavated material, more than 10 miles of narrow gauge railroad had been constructed. In the main tunnel, the tracks were 36-inch gauge, and 20-ton General Electric mine-type locomotives were used with gathering reels and flexible cable for extending the working range beyond the end of the trolley. To complete the project in 3 years, it was necessary to attack the excavation at several places, for obviously only a limited amount of manpower and machinery could be brought into action through the east and west portals alone. The long tunnel crosses under the deep valley of Mill Creek, and this crossing lent itself to the purpose of opening 2 additional working faces. From Mill Creek, directly above the projected tunnel line, a shaft was sunk 622 feet to the level of the proposed tunnel, affording an additional face for attack eastward and another westward, making in all 4 primary faces from the 3 main camps. A pioneer tunnel, located 52.5 feet south of the main tunnel, was then driven eastward from the west portal and westward from the Mill Creek shaft. The crews engaged in this work met on May 1st, 1928. The comparatively small pioneer tunnel could be driven much more rapidly than the main tunnel. As it advanced, crosscuts were driven to connect with the route of the main tunnel at intervals of about every 1,500 feet. This made accessible as many as 11 working faces simultaneously and made possible the employment at one time of almost 1,800 men on the tunneling operations. Later on the completion of the project, President Ralph Budd, who then headed up the Great Northern Railway Company, said the following: "Through the efforts of Jim Hill's followers, the ideals and plans laid out by Jim Hill, the empire builder, are being carried forward constantly, and the Great Northern has continued to be the shortest and easiest line from the Great Lakes to Puget Sound. Leveling the towering Cascades was part of such program." On January 12, 1929, a locomotive pulled the first train through the new 8-mile Cascade Tunnel, the longest tunnel in the Western Hemisphere. This event also inaugurated all-electric operation between Skykomish and Wenatchee, a distance of 73 miles. In connection with the tunnel, other improvements were made in the Cascade Mountains crossing, which, together with the tunnel, shortened the route by almost 9 miles, eliminated 7.5 miles of snow sheds, and 3,674 degrees of curvature, reducing the height of the summit by 502 feet. There were other electric locomotives operated on the GN besides the well-known 5000 class. The railroad had acquired a large interurban system, the Spokane Coeur d'Alene and Palouse Railway, and converted 2 of its locomotives to dual voltage so they could be used on the GN main line for light passenger or work train service.
Once through the mountains, there still was work to be done on the west coast. The Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company was a line controlled by Edward H. Harriman. So the Great Northern built the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railroad. Here again is Dr. White.
The construction of the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railroad flows directly out of Hill's bitter rivalry with E.H. Harriman. Harriman controlled the Union Pacific, which in turn controlled the line along the south bank of the Columbia River into Portland. That gave him direct access to the West Coast ports. Hill wanted for the Great Northern his own access to that, so they built along the north shore of the Columbia River.
Earlier, Ralph Budd had spent some time grounding himself in the field of electric traction by his work for the Spokane and Coeur d'Alene interurban subsidiary of the Jim Hill system. This is a line that ran off to the east over to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho from Spokane, and it also went down to a place called Moscow, Idaho. And Ralph Budd was the engineer on some of that work. He then went to the SP&S, where he served as chief engineer once again. He was really the de facto president, ultimately, of the Great Northern System, but on the SP&S, he worked on the Oregon electrification, which went from Portland down for 125 miles down to Salem and Eugene, in competition with the SP Southern Pacific interurban system there.
The Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railroad provided main shop services for the Oregon Electric, and they began in the 1940s by rebuilding equipment from passenger cars into freight locomotives. They developed an interesting articulated type of locomotive. The Oregon Electric number 50 and 51 were heavy locomotives built with the passenger car motors and trucks, but using their own car bodies and so on. And these locomotives had further reuse. After the Oregon Electric switched to diesel operation, these locomotives were sold to the Chicago, North Shore, and Milwaukee Railroad, where they became number 458, the box cab type, and number 459, which is more or less of a steeple cab type. Now, some of the heavy electric locomotives on the Cascade Tunnel Division were also reused, some of them going to the Pennsylvania Railroad for service in the electrification between Harrisburg and New York. So Oregon Electric got a lot out of their locomotives. Oregon Electric also rebuilt some of their smaller passenger car equipments into lighter but still articulated locomotives of the 60 class. 3 of those, 360 to 362, were sold to the Fort Dodge Des Moines and Southern 1200-volt line out in Iowa, where they put in many more Goodyears. The Great Northern also sold some of its equipment from the Spokane Coeur d'Alene division. 3 or 4 locomotives went off to the Bamberger Electric Railroad, and that reminds me that in the coaches and even that equipment was reused. The Oregon Electric had coaches built by Niles and Barney and Smith and people like that, a sleeping car and a parlor observation car. All of those went up to the Pacific Great Eastern in Canada. So their equipment went really from coast to coast. The locomotives that were built for Oregon Electric as locomotives in the early period of about 1910, some of them survived and went on up to the British Columbia Electric Railway operating out of Vancouver. And believe it or not, one Oregon Electric locomotive survives today because it was sold from the British Columbia Electric to the Edmonton light rail system, where it's used in work train service. Out there running today, Oregon Electric survives. Another Coeur d'Alene locomotive was acquired and saw many additional years of service on the Tacoma Municipal Beltway. And the Insel system, to test the freight capabilities of the old South Shore line, rented an Inland Empire AC locomotive for service on the line out to South Bend.
Jim Hill not only was interested in agriculture, but in forests and minerals, all of which needed transportation on his railroads. The Anaconda Copper Company owned what was described as the richest hill on earth. To move the copper to the smelter, the Butte, Anaconda, and Pacific was formed.
Butte, Anaconda, and Pacific was a very short line connecting, as the title implies, Butte and Anaconda, servicing the mines owned by the Anaconda Copper Company, led by Marcus Daly, to the smelters. Hill was closely involved in that enterprise. They built it for Daly, at one time owned a substantial amount of stock in the road. It's crucially important to those mines emerging as the principal copper producing mines in the nation. And Hill plays an important role in that enterprise. It's terribly important. When Hill decides to build west, they arrive in what's then Montana Territory at Butte and Anaconda in 1887. That's the same year those mines passed the Upper Michigan mines as the #1 copper producing mines in the nation. Hill busts the rate pool that was strangling that between the Northern Pacific and his old rival, the Union Pacific, offers cheaper rates on the better grades to the largest ore shipments going out of that part of the country. It's terribly important. It cements an alliance between Hill and Marcus Daly of the Anaconda Company against the powerful Northern Pacific, Union Pacific, and rival mine owners in that state.
The BA&P was an early user of electric traction. Again, this is rail historian George Crambles.
Butte Anaconda Pacific is a most unusual electrification. It's now practically gone from the world, but back in the 1912, this little 25-mile line was electrified with a most unusual 2400-volt direct current system. And it ran from the source of the copper in the Butte Hill, in Butte, Montana, about 25 miles to the location of the smelters at Anaconda, Montana. That was the Butte Anaconda Pacific, which is a very important contributor to the electrification of railroads throughout the world because it generated the copper that was needed.
The smelter hill itself was an unlivable place, but there was a neat little residential area just a few miles to the west. To connect the two, the Anaconda Copper Company maintained an electric car line operated by its own street railway department.
Many of the immigrants Hill brought to the Northwest came from the Scandinavian countries, and many of those became involved in the logging industry. The great stands of timber filled many a train on the Great Northern, and the immigrants brought their culture and their music to the Northwest. Well before the turn of the 20th century, Jim Hill's Great Northern was in the iron business in northern Minnesota in a big way. Albro Martin, in his massive biography of Hill, put it this way: "No phase of Hill's long career seems more fortuitous, in view of hundreds of millions of dollars that eventually brought the stockholders of the Great Northern, than his involvement in the iron ore deposits of the Great Mesabi Range in northern Minnesota." The steelmaking industry and the railroads at the turn of the century were basic industries of the burgeoning new economy of the United States. For the steel industry, iron ore was the basic ingredient. Hill's sons, Lewis and James Norman, convinced their father that they should buy the barren cut-over lands under whose surface were great quantities of high-grade iron ore. The Hill interests purchased the Little Duluth and Winnipeg Railroad and immediately rebuilt it to carry the massive tonnage of the red dust to the port at Lake Superior. One other facet of Hill's personality was his love for shipping on the Great Lakes. In 1888, 6 long freighters were built for his Northern Steamship Company. In these and other leased vessels, the red iron ore went to the steel mills on the lower lakes. By shipping ore and grain and lumber to Duluth Superior, and then moving the freight by lake boats eastward, Hill bypassed the high-priced rail lines to Chicago and Buffalo. Then in 1894, he ordered built the most palatial passenger liner seen on the lakes up to that time, the Northwest. The next year, a sister, the Northland, joined the passenger service between Duluth and Buffalo and major ports in between. Great Lakes historian, the Reverend Edward J. Dowling, has written, "Mr. Hill stated that these vessels were to be in no way inferior to the finest transatlantic liners of the day." Well, the two never made any money and sometimes were referred to as Hill's White Elephants, but he believed they were good advertising for his railroad. Indeed, manufactured goods coming to Duluth by water then could be shipped by his Great Northern Railroad to the West Coast and transshipped to the Far East. Hill always wanted trade with the Orient, so his Northern Steamship Company built 2 of the world's largest cargo vessels, the Minnesota and the Dakota, for trade between Seattle and the Far East. This picture dates from 1905. The train in the foreground is the Oriental Limited. Hill once wrote, "Go back and read the history of the world. The nation that has controlled the trade to the Orient has held the purse strings of the world." Perhaps those words still carry truth in our time. Well, because of Jim Hill's fascination with the Far East, one of the premier trains of the Great Northern Railway was named the Oriental Limited. It was first scheduled from St. Paul to Seattle in December of 1905. However, the premier train for years was the Empire Builder, named in honor of James Jerome Hill and the work he did in populating and developing the Northwest. The train began on June 10th of 1929, running between Chicago and Tacoma. Later versions of the train were both lightweight and streamlined and hauled by either diesel or electric engines. But with the advent of the diesels, the Great Northern ended the electric operation in 1956. Both the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern had stations at two of the national parks. For the Northern Pacific, it was Yellowstone Park, and it brought visitors there year after year for decades. For the Great Northern, it passed the southern boundary of Glacier National Park, running for some miles along the middle fork of the Flathead River. The Great Northern promoted Western tourism heavily because of the scenic beauty of the Montana Rockies. For nearly 50 years, it operated hotels and other facilities until their sale in 1960. One of the Northern Pacific's named trains was the Main Streeter. Running through the prairies, it was transportation to a lot of people over the years. The scenes of warm welcome were played over and over again. The train was a civilized way to travel, and over the years almost everybody did, including the aged and the infirm. Even the dead were carried. But the Northern Pacific's flagship train was the North Coast Limited. In his book, Some Classic Trains, author Arthur Dubin pointed out that the North Coast Limited was not only the pride of the Northern Pacific, it was the talk of the West after its inaugural run on April 29th of 1900. As on other railroads, the equipment of the North Coast Limited was upgraded and improved from time to time. In short, it was among the luxury trains of the nation, having such accommodations as bath, maid, barber, stewardess nurse, buffet lounge, as well as the necessary dining and sleeping cars. From the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis, the Hill lines went to the West Coast. But Hill wanted his own connection with the railroads which stretched eastward from Chicago. Right around the turn of the 20th century, Hill looked at several of the lines between Chicago and the Twin Cities. The Great Western had poor terminal facilities. The Northwestern didn't have enough ramifications to the south and southwest. The Milwaukee Road, which had a good terminal in downtown Minneapolis, became the last of the northern transcontinentals, but it was too late. Here again is Dr. White.
Hill had always had a relationship with Charles Perkins, head of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. This was the rich Midwestern Railroad with marvelous lines to Chicago as well as very profitable on its own lines. And it made a lot of sense for Hill to obtain control of that, which he did in 1901 through stock purchase. Basically, he outbid E.H. Harriman for control of that line.
One of the things Hill liked about the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy was its construction. The builders had done a good job, but there was more. Transportation historian James Neubauer has observed and studied the Q, as it was fondly called.
Jim Hill once said, "Most men who have really lived have had in some shape their great adventure. This railway is mine." Jim Hill, on his great adventure, was looking for an outlet to Chicago for his Great Northern Railway. The astutely managed Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy caught his eye. The Burlington had never known bankruptcy, it was profitable, and it had the connections that Jim Hill was looking for.
From its 1849 beginnings as the Aurora Branch Railroad, with a locomotive and cars borrowed from the Galena and Chicago Union, the CB&Q prospered and expanded. In 1885, a construction railroad, the Chicago, Burlington, and Northern, together with the Chicago and Iowa Railroad, built a line up the east bank of the Mississippi River. A railroad war had been waged and lost for a line up the west bank to the twin Minnesota communities of St. Anthony and St. Paul. which were reached in 1886. St. Anthony, of course, became Minneapolis. Hill liked what he saw in the CB&Q. The Twin Cities in Minnesota were not the railroad capital that was Chicago. Traffic was a balance, Hill knew, and raw materials and imports eastbound, manufacturers, textiles, and provisions westbound, and the CB&Q, headquartered in Chicago, would provide the traffic balance. Hill bought the Burlington in 1901 at $200 a share. Big Jim's Northern Pacific and Great Northern each had slightly less than 49%. Only about 2% of the Burlington stock remained privately owned. In 1908, the Colorado and Southern, Fort Worth and Denver City were bought by the Burlington, and James Hill then had a friendly diagonal transcontinental line from Puget Sound to the Gulf of Mexico. The only problem was the Panama Canal Act of 1914, which specifically forbade transporting materials between the Gulf and Hill's steamships sailing the Pacific. The line's good fortunes suffered as a result. In 1907, from their business car, Hill's surveyors took a long, hard look at the railroad where nature smiles 300 miles along the Mississippi River between Savannah, Illinois, and St. Paul, Minnesota. The surveyors eased curves around the base of the bluffs, with dikes shortcutted across sloughs and floodplains, and converted the rustic single track of the CB&N into a double-track high-speed main line that foretold of zephyrs to come. Jim Hill never missed a chance to promote his railroad service, such as showing off the 1924 equipment and power of the Empire Builder in Savannah. A new Empire Builder was placed in service in 1947. On June 3, 1951, I rode the first trip of the mid-century Empire Builder, and the 1947 equipment became a new train called the Western Star. 5 or so years later, the Builder was re-equipped with dome cars, full-length cars for Pullman passengers, short domes for coach passengers. I'll never know why, because other than for the trip along the Mississippi rivers, Great Northern's trains were scheduled to run through the best scenery of the Rockies at night. The Northerns were training ground for the Burlington executives such as Ralph Budd, who brought railroading out of the dark ages of heavy weights and steam into the bright sunshine of diesel streamliners, starting with the Pioneer Zephyr and culminating in a Zephyr fleet. On May 26, 1934, Burlington staged one of the greatest transportation events of the 30s, a 1,000-mile record-breaking nonstop run from Denver, Chicago to the World's Fair on Chicago's lakefront, where the Pioneer Zephyr climaxed the Wings of a Century transportation pageant. Bulletins had been broadcast throughout the day as the train streaked through villages and cities. At 8:09 p.m., the Pioneer Zephyr rolled onto the stage and bedlam broke loose. A world's long-distance record had been set, and the value of diesel-electric power was firmly established. In reporting the run to his directors, President Ralph Budd emphasized 2 facts. The fuel cost for the 1,000-mile trip was $14.64, and the highest speed attained was 112.5 miles per hour. In a nutshell, economy and speed, basis for the coming revolution in railroading.
Chicago commuter service on the Burlington dates back to the 1860s. This suburban train was pictured about 1880 as it was ready to leave Downers Grove Yard.
If steam excursions were a tool to attract a coterie of fans, as well as make a good impression on shippers and keep a cash flow going through the passenger department, then let the good times roll with the 4960 and the 5632 and the 5618 on all kinds of fan trips along the Mississippi River. But the times were a-changing. After many previous attempts, Great Northern Pacific and Burlington lines finally had authority to become Burlington Northern. The Aurora racetrack was briefly filled with GN's Big Sky Blue, the green and orange of Spokane, Portland, and Seattle diesels, and lastly the Cascade Green of Burlington Northern. The merger date of March 2, 1970 melded Burlington lines, the oldest and largest of the partners, into the super railroad we call Burlington Northern.
When Henry Villard posed atop one of the locomotives which brought invited VIPs to the Northern Pacific's final spike ceremony at Gold Creek, Montana on September 8th of 1883, it was the start of the European immigrants' takeover of the vast lands of the northwest quadrant of the country. Jim Hill's little engine, which arrived at St. Paul in 1861, also was a beginning, and the two roads which developed in parallel were destined to affect generations. And Jim Hill emerged as the dominant figure whose legacy extends to this day. Yim Hill, as the Swedish of the Northwest called him, was not only a driving railroad man, but always involved in the affairs of his adopted city, St. Paul. The well-known Minnesota rail historian and writer Frank Donovan once penned these words about Hill. Time was precious to him, and he made every minute count. He did nevertheless relax and enjoy his hobbies, foremost of which was art. His 32-room mansion on St. Paul's fashionable Summit Avenue housed a gallery of Corrots, Renoirs, and others. Hill also was a family man. Married Mary Mahegan at the age of 29. They had 9 children, 6 girls and 3 boys. The boys all had a try at railroading, but only his oldest son, Lewis, made it his life's work and succeeded his father on the railroads. What man has had as visible a monument to his memory as is afforded by the Jim Hill Bridge over the Mississippi between St. Paul and Minneapolis? It has served for decades through the steam era into the diesel age. When it became economic for barge traffic to go above the bridge, 2 spans were taken out on the Minneapolis side and replaced with a steel structure, much to the disappointment of those who saw the bridge as an artistic part of the Twin Cities. Another building in Minneapolis which was something of a monument to Hill while it lasted was the Great Northern Passenger Station. Here, where the Twin Cities trolleys passed and exchanged passengers with the trains, the building was a classical adornment to the Mill City. So the Canadian youth who came up the river on a steamboat and settled in St. Paul before the Civil War became known as the Empire Builder because he had been so instrumental in the opening and the populating of the Northwest between the Twin Cities and the West Coast. He took a certain pride in what he had done. He once wrote, "I've made my mark on the surface of the earth, and they can't wipe it out."
And just what was Jim Hill's contribution to the Northwest and the country as a whole?
I think Jim Hill played a pivotal role in opening up the Northwest to settlement and stable transportation system. His was not the first railroad, certainly, across the Northwest. The Northern Pacific did that in 1883. Hill's was one of the last transcontinental railroads, but he promoted it, eventually took over control for a time of the Northern Pacific Railroad, de facto control of it, and operated in an efficient manner that guaranteed the hauling of bulk cargo freight to and from this upper northwest quadrant of the nation. The business environment of the 19th century wasn't terribly stable. It was a boom-bust pattern. We were a debtor nation, seeking capital everywhere, and it was scarce, hard to get. We managed to get through all those problems rather readily. We have problems today, but probably for someone who is that bright, given what he had to deal with at the time, I think he would have done well in any time.
So, for decades, Jim Hill's railroads carried the resources and production of the Northwest, providing the necessary transportation ingredient for a modern economy. The freight included wheat from the plains to make bread for a nation, the fruit from the Pacific Northwest, copper for the wires to carry the electricity which was generated by the big river dams, oil from the Williston Basin along with the automobile which used that oil, the trailer trucks and containers which seem to be the latter-day boxcars. Even the aircraft industry received its raw materials from the railroads. The Great Northern announcer described the departure from the Twin Cities of the line's premier freight train, number 401.
The high blow is given. Mammoth machines to reap tomorrow's harvest. Television sets for the farm homes of Dakota and Montana. Mill work and roofing for the many new homes needed to house the Northwest's rapidly growing populations. Dynamos and insulators and cable for the region's expanding power facilities. Food for millions of hungry mouths.
Then, in 1970, all the Jim Hill lines were merged into the Burlington Northern, carrying ever more freight. The St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad, otherwise known as the Frisco, was merged into the Burlington Northern in 1980. It would be stretching things to say that it was a Jim Hill line, even though it had its own history, which began in the mid-1800s. So the Frisco is another story. When Amtrak took over the long-distance passenger train service, Jim Hill's name train, the Empire Builder, continued to run from Chicago to the Pacific coast. Indeed, other Amtrak trains, including the California Zephyr, also continue on tracks of the former Hill lines.
A quarter century after the Jim Hill lines were folded into the Burlington Northern, it was announced that the BN and the Santa Fe intended to merge to better compete against the Union Pacific. So it appears that Jim Hill and Ed Harriman are still at it, and the Jim Hill legend only gets bigger.
1,000 miles of mountains, from prairie to Puget.